NATO foreign ministers in Brussels have been discussing plans for a multi-year funding commitment to provide long-term military support for Ukraine. It comes as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky signed into law a new bill that lowered the country's draft-eligible age for men from 27 to 25. That will allow Ukraine to call up more people to replenish its reserves after volunteer numbers dropped. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Associate Professor Matthew Sussex, who's with the Australian National University's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Very good morning to you, Matthew. So, firstly, what difference do you think the change to the age that men are eligible to sign up for, what difference will it make?
Well, Lorna, I think it'll make a quite considerable difference. One of the things that has bedeviled Ukraine for about the last 6 months is finding a supply of replacements, frankly, to send to the front line. And what this decision does, shifting the age down from 27 to 25, is that it avoids the kind of thing like a general mobilization of the population, which would have been deeply unpopular, and also included people. Captured people who might have, had medical conditions, who were aging and so forth. So I think this is, an important thing that Zelensky has done. Whether it proves to be enough, I suppose, depends on how long this conflict actually drags on.
Yeah, and, Ukraine is always going to be outnumbered and outgunned. But are you seeing signs within Ukraine of fatigue in not just the men serving, but in support for the war?
Yeah, I think support for the war continues pretty much at the same level, but there is, I think, frustration, particularly with the lack of progress from the counteroffensive that was launched last year, and now, of course, the Russians have turned the table and are starting to advance, albeit very slowly themselves. So many Ukrainians are probably thinking, how long does this go on? That certainly hasn't translated yet into a desire to say, OK, well, let's go to the negotiating table. Because, of course, if they do that, then they're unlikely to get very favourable terms from Vladimir Putin.
I mentioned funding. Of course, it's an ongoing issue for the president. NATO foreign ministers discussing a multi-year funding package. Of course, it's what America is or isn't doing that's the most important. Where do we stand there?
Yes, well, the Speaker of the US House, Mike Johnson, has said that he would take up Ukraine support bill after Easter. And there's a fair bit of wrangling over, just whether or not this money would be in the form of loans or whether it would be direct money. But NATO itself is certainly talking big in terms of about 100 billion US dollars over 5 years. And the intention there, I think, is to kind of avoid these constant drip feeds of funding support from individual member nations and to have a sort of central pool that's coordinated by NATO, as well as, European nations within the EU taking on some more of the burden.
What are Australia's current contributions?
Yeah, well, Australia currently sits, I think, around about 36th globally in terms of aid, provided just under $1 billion worth of aid, both military and non-military. In terms of overall GDP, I think we're somewhere around the bottom 2 of the OECD nations, and we're the 12th largest economy in the world. So there have been some questions about what can be done, and I think it's quite interesting that one thing the government has done is to ask the committee that deals with Foreign Affairs and Defence to take a look at whether the amount of support, the timeliness of the aid, and the type of aid is the right kind. And I think that's a very good development that can help speed and streamline Australia's contributions. And the other thing it does is also takes a look at the question of whether we are paying enough attention to Russian misinformation and disinformation in Australia and our own region. Certainly something that I think that we don't pay enough attention to and is increasingly creeping into our society.
OK, that's interesting. Why do you say that, and in what forms do you mean?
Well, you see, particularly on social media and some, blogs that deal with world affairs, starting to use publications that are part of the Russian misinformation ecosystem. These are not necessarily tied at all to the Russian government, but certainly platform authors who are very, adept at recycling Kremlin narratives. And I think the worry is that in Australia, we tend to think that Russia is a long way away, and that it's not a problem that we really face. But in fact, Russia is quite enthusiastic about interfering with democracies, and Australia is no exception. Russia lists Australia as an unfriendly nation, and it's certainly been very active within Southeast Asia as well, talking about things like colonialism as a bad thing, imperialism as a bad thing, and the United States and its role in the region as being fundamentally destabilizing. And these are things I think that we need to pay a lot more attention to, both at home and within our immediate region too.
Very interesting. Associate Professor Matthew Sussex, thank you.
Thanks, Lorna.